Hello everyone, welcome to my response to week 2. I have 5 questions that I'm going to respond to today. The first question is, actually it's not a question, it's more of a statement. I just want you to be patient with yourself and patient with Metzger whenever you're reading the text. Believe it or not, Metzger was written for students on your level, introductory students to the New Testament in college. The problem is, it was written for students 30 years ago and not students today. So some of the things in Metzger are kind of hard to understand because they presume a different context. However, Metzger is still a very important text because it's a middle of the road kind of book, and a lot of professors try to choose books like this because he's not all the way to the right, he's not all the way to the left, he is at a middle ground. And a lot of students in this class and in previous courses have commented on how much they appreciate that Metzger is the kind of guy that reviews the evidence and then comes up with a conclusion. I do want you to be careful, however, in assuming that Metzger is not biased or that he's not totally to the right in Christianity. In other words, there's Orthodox Christianity, and most of us know what that means is you follow a traditional view of Christianity, like Jesus rose on the third day, and the early Christian creeds are truth, and so on and so forth. Well, Metzger is a Christian, so whenever he writes, he examines the critical evidence, and it might be a little bit new for most of you. You know, he's reviewing the ancient manuscripts, and he's saying, yes, there are differences, which is significant if you're a Baptist and you grew up like me in a conservative Baptist church, and the Bible is the Bible by God, and we believe it. Well, whenever you start studying it in a more serious way, you see that the Bible is kind of messy. You know, there are a lot of texts. There's not just one, and in fact, there's 350,000 texts, and no two of them match. So that's a pretty significant problem if you come from the background I come from. And some people go to atheism because of that, and some people just go all the way to the right. You know, they go all the way to a kind of Christianity that doesn't need any proof for anything, and they're just going to go on believing whatever they want. And then there's the middle of the road that Metzger chooses. You know, he still believes, but he examines the evidence, and he is able to be honest about the evidence and yet still have faith. So that's the thing with Metzger. Be patient with him. You're not going to understand him all the time. Don't neglect Wikipedia. You know, Wiki is the very best source that you can use. That is handy, right at your fingertips. You can do it on your phone or on your iPod, on your iPad, and you can do it on your computer while you're reading. You can look up the meanings of the words it uses that you don't understand, and you'll have an excellent review. A lot of scholars, you know, people way above me, have contributed to Wikipedia in every field. So it's something that's fast becoming a scholarly source. However, you still cannot use it in your papers because it has no, it's still anonymous. It has no person that, the one person that wrote it. You know, in scholarship, you have to know who wrote something and when in order for it to be used as proof in a paper. So you're still not able to use it in papers, but you can use it as a dictionary. So please do. Okay, another question. How did people get the title great in the ancient world? Excellent question. Naming conventions were different back then. They named their kids a little bit differently. It's kind of like what George Foreman does. All of George Foreman's kids are named George Foreman. Well, all of Alexander's kids are going to be named Alexander, or son of Alexander. And so historians, in order to pick out which person they're talking about within a particular family, they will say Alexander the Great, the guy who conquered everybody, or Ivan the Terrible, Ivan the Great. These are titles given to people, usually, almost always, by historians or by writers during their own time. Like Alexander the Great comes from writers who wrote during his time. You know, he actually had that title, the Great, next to his name in the earliest history books. So that's how you get it. Many people were named Herod. Lots and lots of people were named Herod in Herod's family. And Herod the Great is the great one. He's the one that built all the buildings and accomplished great things during his reign. Okay, significance of Q. This is confusing. Q is confusing, but it's not that difficult. The baseline stuff that you need to know for your midterm is not that difficult. We have 4 Gospels. I can't see my. There we are. We have 4 Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. John is unlike the others, so we have 3 synoptics that are similar. 3 similar Gospels: Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And there is a thread that threads these books together, and that is Q. It's the similarities between the 3 of these documents, and Q is considered the source. And you got to work out somehow Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the writers of those Gospels, had access to a source, and this source is hypothetical. It does not exist. Just to repeat, Q does not exist. It's kind of like X in math. X is a hypothetical number, and for our the purposes of this metaphor, X is a hypothetical number, but it's useful because it does exist in sort of a theoretical kind of hypothetical way. Like there is no document that scholars have found that's Q. There is no expectation of scholars to find a Q exactly like what we have, because what we have is hypothetical. Why is it hypothetical? Well, we have the final draft. We have Matthew, Mark, and Luke. We have the final product. And as we look at that product, we can see that there are older verses. There are older little pieces within this puzzle. How do we know it's older? Well, you have Matthew, Mark, and Luke. One of them had to come first, probably Mark, and the other 2 copied from that material. Well, where did Mark get his? He got his from Q. And maybe Luke and Matthew had access to Q as well. So it gets very, very confusing. But, say we find a final product, we can identify older pieces, and we think, scholars think that there's a sayings gospel that we don't have that is comprised at least of these similarities between Matthew, Mark, and Luke. So I realized as I was saying that, it kind of got a little bit confusing, but just to repeat, we have 4 Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. John is unique. It doesn't share the same source as Matthew, Mark, and Luke. But Matthew, Mark, and Luke have a lot in common, and that commonality is Q. Q is hypothetical because we do not have it. Scholars can reconstruct Q based on comparing the 3 Gospels that we have. And so Q is like a hypothetical reconstruction. You take pieces out of one thing and you put it together somewhere else. So I hope that did more good than harm. Legitimacy of Scripture. I think we touched on this last time, but it's come up again, and I think that that's a very significant issue. And we kind of touched on that. My hat's just driving me nuts. I think we touched on that last time, but it's still a very significant issue because we're still talking about how the New Testament and early Christianity was messy. It was not, skipping through meadows and, they're writing the New Testament and everybody loves each other and, just everything's going to be great until the Reformation when the Catholic Church takes over everything. So that's not how things happened. What happened was you had these 12 followers of Jesus who went out into the entire world, to the entire ancient world, and they took with them the teachings of Jesus. Eventually, these teachings were written down, and then they were copied like crazy because there were a lot of Christians. Christians kept growing as time went on. Now, the 2 things to remember, they're very, very important. For one thing, there was no printing press. There were no copyright laws. And obviously, there were no computers. So we have grown up, you and I and our children and our grandfathers and our grandfathers had grown up in a world where it was possible to take something and print it exactly as it had been existed in the original. Like we can go to a Xerox machine, put that copy down, what we want copied, and we can get exactly what it is every single time. And we have a very high standard of legitimacy. Like it's only legitimate if it's exactly copied exactly the same way. Well, the reason why we believe that is because it's so easy for us to do it. Now, in the ancient world, if you wanted something copied, you would pay a scribe. Now, that scribe, in our case, may or may not have been a Christian, and it was relatively expensive to do for the type of job that we're looking at for the New Testament. If you want to copy a letter of Paul, it takes 3 or 4 sheets of parchment, it takes the ink, and all of the other materials that you need to write. Most people could not write in the ancient world. Most people could not read. What was going on was we had few scribes who did the work of writing for a community, and a few readers who did the reading for the community. In Christianity, it could have been, and probably almost always was, the bishop was able to read, and the bishop would read the manuscript to the Christian community, and thus the text is used in worship, and this text is passed down. Other texts not used in worship are not copied, and they're lost. So, there's no ancient conspiracy here. It's just practical living. It explains how we got the New Testament. So, anyway, there's no printing press, there's no copyright laws. So the scribes would copy, and copying is not just looking at the words and inscribing them exactly on another piece of paper. What could have happened, and happened a lot, was a reader would be reading the text out loud, and the scribe would be copying it. Like transcribing, listening with his ears or her ears, excuse me, and writing based on hearing. And as you know, whenever you're listening to words, you can misunderstand words. You can also misspell words. You're not looking at the exact thing that you're copying. And then, as the reader would read, sometimes the reader would skip a line and just read the line beneath it instead of the line you're supposed to be reading. So it might not have made sense to the scribe, and the scribe can fill some stuff in really quick and then keep going. Or the reader would turn over a leaf and he will turn 2 pages at once. So you have those kind of errors as well. And then you have times whenever scribes change stuff based on theology. And the only thing you really need to do in that case is change one letter of a word. An example of that is the word homoousios and homoousios. Homoousios and homoousios, u and e, are different. It's a difference of one letter, and that divided a whole lot of churches in the ancient world because they were fighting over, or the bishops rather, were fighting over, is God the same substance as Jesus or a different substance as Jesus? Homoousios, same. Homoousios, different. So you don't need to change a whole lot in order to change something significantly in theology and something that can divide a church. So there developed different cities that were very important because they were major cities to begin with. They had a lot of Christians. Rome is a good example. Alexandria is a good example. Alexandria is in Egypt. Rome is in Italy. And Christians gathered there, and they're copying the texts over and over and over and over again. With every generation, they're copying texts. With every bishop that comes in, the bishop needs more texts, and they're producing hundreds and hundreds of texts. Well, there became retentions because certain scribes were copying the Alexandrian texts, and certain scribes were copying the Roman texts. And this happened all over the ancient world. So you have 350,000 in the end, 350,000 different manuscripts and fragments of the New Testament. No two of them agree completely. They agree mostly. But whenever you go to start talking about legitimacy and inerrancy of Scripture, that Scripture has no errors, you really get into trouble because there's so many different texts. It's hard to even say this is the New Testament text because scholars are still today going through those 350,000 texts and producing uh, New Testaments. Now they're not all that different from each other, but they're different enough to where we need to start thinking about what it means whenever people hold up a Bible. Pastors hold up a Bible and say, we need to be following this. Well, because it's perfect. Well, it's not perfect. It was a very messy process. So that's something to think about. So no printing press, no copyright law. There's nothing governing, how people copy text back then. So how is the Scripture legitimate? Well, it's made legitimate through the use in worship. That is the only criteria that people use. Well, the main priority is how is it used in worship. It's inspired because it inspires. The church uses the Bible. It's very special. It's imperfect, but it's very special. And we find our hope in it. We find our experience of God through it. And we have this inspired work here in our hands. We know it's inspired because it does great things. And it also can be abused, but it does do great things. So that's where the legitimacy comes from. It comes from its use in worship. Okay, did God die on the cross? That's another interesting question. I do not know. The number one guy to look for is Thomas. I think it's A.A. Altizer. A.A. is abbreviations for his two middle names. Thomas Altizer. He is the leading voice in Christian atheism. He believes that God died on the cross as Jesus, but the thing is, God didn't resurrect, so God is dead. Obviously, he is heavily influenced by Nietzsche, and it's very interesting, but if I knew the answer to that question, I would be a very wealthy scholar, and I would be off surfing or something like that. So anyway, I hope that this response is useful to you. Again, we covered being patient with Metzger. The title of The Great is given by other people, usually historians. The significance of Q. It's what unites the three synoptics together. And legitimacy of Scripture. They didn't have the printing press or computers or Xerox machines, so the copying was different in different Christian centers. So, and then did God die on the cross? I don't know. So anyway, let me know if you have any questions, and I will be delighted to hear from you.